It's widely said that history is written by the winners. But if someone says that, then you immediately know that they've never read or studied history at all, because it's the most misunderstood phrase there is. So let me explain. At the end of World War II, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt met at Yalta to determine the post war settlement. They were effectively writing history because they were the winners, and that's what the phrase means. But the writing of history books is entirely different. That's historiography, and there's no accepted version of history mandated by our leaders and then transcribed by historians. The writing of history is the direct opposite of that. Always critical, questioning, challenging accepted viewpoints. Historians are never prepared to accept popular narratives. That's why they spend their entire lifetimes digging through sources, archives, and evidence to try to unearth the truth. No one ever engages on a historical research project to confirm a theory. It's always to challenge it. And they're far better at such endeavours than the people who have zero experience of this type of detective work, but who blindly dismiss their efforts and decades of professional experience as just written by the winners. More than this, history, like science, is a collective endeavour. It's not judged on the work of a single historian. Such efforts are only a thread in a colossal fabric, a tiny piece of a monumental jigsaw puzzle. History must be judged on the entire body of knowledge, not on individual and sometimes flawed efforts. And I can assure you that there are no government agencies in the winning powers mandating what historians have to write. Historians are a belligerent bunch. Attempting to corral them in that manner would be akin to herding cats. More than this, any historian's interpretation is immediately challenged by their peers, who will produce their own sharply contrasting perspectives to any new or popular thesis. So the academic discipline of history is emphatically not written by the winners. It's quite the inverse. But as stated, most people never engage with that literature at all. They're merely aware of the popular image of history, one largely dependent on misinformation and rumour, influenced far more by Hollywood than any academic rigour. And in their ignorance, they mistake these polar opposites for the same thing. And this leads to some wild misconceptions in the public consciousness. This leads to people getting trapped in their own histories, even if the history they cleave to is largely a fantasy, a mirage. Let's take Scotland as an example. Since time immemorial, Scottish fathers have brought their sons up to hate the English, filling them with stories of the rapacious aggression of their neighbours to the south. This still exists, even though it's largely a harmless instinct, one that adds zest and passion to sporting contests. But the truth is the opposite of the public image. For since the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, virtually all conflicts between those nations involved the Scots attacking the English. In 1372, an endless stream of Scottish raids culminated in Henry, Lord Percy, crossing the border, but he was driven back at the Battle of Duns. In 1388, the Scottish noble, James, the Earl of Douglas, led a raid into England. At Otterburn, Northumberland, his force defeated an English army led by Henry Hotspur and Sir Ralph Percy. In 1400, Scottish raiders were defeated at the Battle of Fulhope Law, but in 1402, a group of Scottish nobles launched a coordinated invasion of northern England, but it led to the Scottish defeat, revenge for Henry Hotspur and Henry Percy. This battle is recounted in Shakespeare's Henry IV. The Scots scored a great victory at the Battle of Piper Dean in 1435, and in 1448, the Scots invaded again, advancing into Cumberland and Northumberland, and crushing the English at the Battle of Sark. In 1496, James IV of Scotland supported the usurper Perkin Warbeck and invaded England, In 1513, James invaded again, crossing the border and seizing Norham Castle, though he was killed at the subsequent Battle of Flodden. When his successor, James V, snubbed the English king, Henry VIII invaded and crushed the Scots at Solway Moss in 1542. But Scottish aggression followed again. They signed a treaty with the French king Henry II, who sent troops to Scotland. So the English responded and defeated them at the Battle of Pinkie in 1547. The English had certainly attempted to bully the Scots, but the Highlanders were hardly free from blame. In 1639-40, in protest at the new prayer book of Charles I, the Scots invaded again. This conflict, which helped spark off the English Civil War, became known as the Bishops' War. In 1650, Scotland sided with Charles II and effectively declared war on the new rulers of England again. Cromwell defeated them at the Battle of Dunbar, but in 1715, in the First Jacobite Rebellion, the Scots supported the claim of the Old Pretender, James Stewart. They invaded England yet again, but were defeated at the Battle of Preston. And in 1745, they invaded yet again. In the famed Second Jacobite Rebellion, the Scots supported Bonnie Prince Charlie, crossed the border, and marched as far south as Derby. But the rising ended with defeat at the Battle of Culloden the following year. So Scotland's popular conception of history doesn't bear much relation to the reality. In fact, one could argue that England helped Scotland more than hindered it. Now, I love Scotland, but one has to admit that prior to the 18th century, it was, in global terms, something of a provincial backwater. It had a vibrant culture, nationalistic pride, a warrior spirit, and stunning landscape. But in cultural and economic terms, it lagged far behind, say, Italy. But this all changed when the Act of Union brought Scotland into the United Kingdom in 1707. Just decades after uniting with England, Scotland had become a world leader in economics, engineering, philosophy, literature, mathematics, science, medicine, sociology. The transformation was staggering. And look, it's the Scots who deserve the credit for all of that. But union with England clearly provided the opportunity for the Scots to unleash all that latent talent. And Scotland still punches well above its weight to this day, in literature, comedy, music, politics, and especially in comics, a personal favourite of mine. Scotland is a hive of energy and creativity. Parts of the Scottish psyche might be trapped in a historical fantasy of victimhood, but it hasn't held them back. Scotland has its troubles, as all states do, but it's an unequivocal success story. Yet other cultures have become trapped in a similar narrative and have been less fortunate. Islam is one. There's also a broad perception in that culture that their history is one of victimhood, of being attacked by the West, from the Crusades to Iraq. And most Islamic countries today are either economic basket cases or despotic tyrannies. Yet the reality of their history is also the opposite. For the last 1500 odd years, the vast majority of aggression in that cultural conflict has come from Islam. Now, I'll be covering that in depth in other films, but I'd like to look at another culture that's become trapped in the past, that wallows in a victimhood rather than embraces the changes and opportunities that have opened up. And that's the communities of Black America. Now, like the Scots, those communities have made an immense contribution to culture, particularly in music, cinema and sport, fields which have been utterly transformed by their contribution. The dynamism they brought to those areas, and others, is electrifying. But the overall story of those communities has not been bolstered by that success. It's, sadly, one of failure. The historical suffering those communities went through is undeniable. slavery, Jim Crow laws, redlining, segregation, lynching, the KKK. It's a torturous tale. And it's undeniable that the long period in which they were denied economic opportunity and were largely abandoned by the state and law enforcement had serious consequences. It set them on a cycle of defeatism, poverty, and criminality from which they've been unable to break free. Yet the reasons for all those failures and crises have long since vanished. They're no longer held back by the state. They're offered a leg up. But instead, they're wallowing in their history and refusing to accept that things have changed. And that's because a huge industry relies on selling them the grievance narrative. The likes of Ibram X. Kendi get up to $30,000 an hour for speaking engagements and lucrative book deals. And that income is dependent on them reinforcing a victim narrative that no longer applies. If he, or all his other deranged colleagues like Ta-Nehisi Coates, Robin DiAngelo, and Kehinde Andrews, ever told black people the truth, that they now have opportunities denied to their community for centuries, and that it was incumbent on them to seize them, then they'd be out of a job. So they keep lying and whipping up hate, and they keep consigning the community they claim to care about to poverty, failure, criminality, and defeatism. The race-baiting activists keep telling them that their history is alive, that it defines their existence in the modern day, yet this just holds them back, prevents them from being able to escape their tortured past. I've studied history for my entire life, and the most important thing I've learned about the past is that's the best place for it. People need to study their history, but they should not cling on to it. They need to learn to let go. Some people have. The Irish have a tortured history too, but the Republic is now a successful state, unencumbered by its past, and the North has made enormous progress. The Jews have also proven adept at honouring their history while carving out a successful place in the present. But black Americans and Palestinians have been less successful, as have the Muslims and Hindus who recently turned Leicester into a war zone, clashing over a Kashmir incident that happened decades before they were born, and of which they have only a passing familiarity. Human history is the sum total of human knowledge. It is our best teacher. But our modern radicals seek to junk it, to impugn it, to suggest that it has nothing to teach us but racism and oppression, and that it must be discarded, tarnished, obliterated, to make way for their new utopia. Except the people who want to build this utopia are the most arrogant, abusive, close-minded and unpleasant people on the planet. They don't seek to engage with or understand times and cultures that are different from their own. They just seek to repudiate them with screamed denunciations based on lies and a warped and distorted narrative that bears no relation to reality. They're not historians. They are juvenile and adolescent activists, inflated with a sense of self-righteousness, and virtue and ignorance has always been a poisonous combination. We live in by far the rudest and most unpleasant era in history, and it's all been caused by the Be Kind Brigade. These are a repulsive, nihilistic bunch. They don't just lack curiosity about previous eras. They are horribly judgmental. The terrible, enormously damaging ideas of these radicals are born of this myopic ignorance. As Douglas Murray says, these people haven't listened to anyone. They're so presumptuous they assume that all of the obvious answers would have been dropped on them like rain. They've snuffed out every single light along the path that might have guided them. That's why the war on history matters. It's a fundamental mistake to rob yourself of the ability to understand how everyone before you were born thought. Yet in rejecting the past, the current radicals are repeating its mistakes. launching witch hunts like the Puritans and Spanish Inquisition, censoring art and culture like the Maoists and Khmer Rouge, stoking up division and resentment like the KKK and the Nazis. They are aping all the people they claim to revile. But that's what happens when history is junked and rejected by people who've never studied it. If you want to support this channel, please like, subscribe, and think about buying my books. They're called The Tyranny of the Left, and they go into topics like this in much greater detail. They're available on the links below. Please do feel free to pick them up and let me know what you think. Thank you.